Senator from Michigan.
Before my colleague and friend from Oklahoma leaves the floor, while we disagree on the current debates in terms of voting, I just have to say, when I see him, I constantly thank him for his efforts last year as he worked with us for the community of Flint. And we're finally seeing some hope in terms of replacing and addressing lead contamination. And without the distinguished senator from Oklahoma, that literally would not have happened. And so we have things we disagree on and agree on, and on this one coming together with the families of Flint and particularly the children and the long-term impacts, you will always have a warm space in the hearts of all of us who care deeply about that issue. Thank you very much. Mr. President, I want to speak today about the nomination in front of us, Betsy DeVos. You know, Betsy DeVos's nomination is very personal to many people who live in Michigan because Betsy DeVos is from Michigan. And her vision of education and her actions have unfortunately played a major role in undermining our public schools. Families all across our state can tell the story of her work with Michigan schools firsthand because they've seen it firsthand. They've lived it firsthand. And they all say the same thing. Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who live in cities that are big and small cities, and parents and teachers and principals and community leaders from across the state. Overwhelmingly, they've told me that Betsy DeVos should not be our next Secretary of Education. I can't believe everywhere that I go how people will stop me about this and how strongly people feel in Michigan about this. They're saying this because, among other things, she's pushed for policies that have made charter schools in Michigan less accountable and taken dollars away from public schools, where the vast majority of children get their education, in the process of that. Policies that have hurt our children and put their futures at risk. I've gotten so many emails and phone calls and people involved in every which way, at the grocery store, out in public events, people coming up to me. But I just want to share a couple of emails. Chris, who's a teacher from Harper Woods, who worked as a teacher in the Detroit public schools for over 20 years, wrote and said to me, Betsy DeVos believes in school privatization and vouchers. She's worked to undermine efforts to regulate Michigan charters, even when they clearly fail. The marketplace solution of DeVos's will destroy our democratically governed community schools. Her hostility towards public education disqualifies her. Those are Chris's comments. In Michigan last year, state legislators put together a bipartisan plan. In our state legislature, House and Senate, is majority Republicans, and they put together a bipartisan plan to increase both funding and accountability for Detroit public schools. Mr. President, there's a lot of wonderful things happening in Detroit around businesses coming back to Detroit and economic development, but we have major work to do for our children in the schools. And so there was a huge effort that came together, bipartisan, to increase funding and accountability for the public schools, including charter schools. And it was a common sense proposal. Betsy DeVos led the effort to stop it, particularly the part that brought critically needed public accountability for-profit and nonprofit charter schools. Unfortunately, right now in Michigan, we have a system where anyone can apply to open a charter school. There are no statewide standards for revoking a charter, and taxpayer money is sent to them with virtually no public disclosure requirements. And for example, we have for-profit charter management companies that say they are private businesses And therefore, even though they're getting public money, they say they are private businesses and they should not have to comply with a series of disclosure requirements regarding teachers and other information that, frankly, parents would want to know and taxpayers have a right to know. 38% of charters in Michigan are at the bottom of the 25% of schools in our state. So when you look at the bottom fourth, 38% of the charters are in that category, and there is unfortunately very little accountability for their performance. And sadly, precious taxpayer dollars have been taken away from public schools, neighborhood schools, to fund these charters. And when it comes to funding for public schools, she won't commit to protecting the critical federal dollars that serve our children. One mom, Hillary Young, from Detroit, came to Washington to watch the confirmation hearing on Betsy DeVos in the Help Committee. She wrote to me, she said she was not impressed and told a group of parents afterwards, "As a parent, I can't stand silently and watch other children be subject to similar circumstances to my child in Detroit. My sixth grader was without a math teacher for over half the year last year because of funding reductions. The effect of DeVos policies is not parents voting with their feet to go to better schools, it's children bearing the burden for fixing the education system they're supposed to be served by." And she goes on to say, DeVos's ideal free market school choice system has left our city's education landscape in chaos, leaving less choice, less quality, and even more government bureaucracy. We've seen parents get involved and speak out all across Michigan and frankly all across the country. I've gotten more mail, more emails, more phone calls on this nominee than any other, and I've gotten a lot on a lot of nominees. But there is a broad outcry. People like Kathleen, who's a farmer and a grandmother from Farmington Hills, who wrote to me, "We have 15 grandchildren who are in the public school system, and we are terrified that there will be no more public schools and that the quality will be far inferior to charter and other private schools. I'm writing you to respectfully ask that you do not vote to confirm Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education." And I'm deeply concerned about what we heard in committee about her views on special education. In the Help hearing last week, she suggested that states should decide on whether or not to enforce IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, that has been such a landmark, opening doors of schools in every neighborhood across our country for children with disabilities. This law was enacted in 1975 and makes sure that children with disabilities have the same educational opportunities as other children. My nephew Barry, who has now gone through the special education system in Michigan, is a wonderful young man with Down syndrome, and I've seen personally how important that was for him to be able to go on now and be successful in the community, as a part of the community. And it is a very important civil right, frankly, for children with disabilities, as well as an essential part of our educational system. Now, Betsy DeVos, after her hearing, followed up when she was asked about special education. She followed up with a letter days later and wrote about, quote, expanding the conversation about school choice opportunities for parents of children with disabilities. But she didn't say anything about helping those in traditional public schools or helping students in the schools that they are now. Mr. President, for me, this is not about politics or partisan messaging, or even charters or private schools versus traditional public schools. It really is about what's best for our children and for our country. Families in Michigan and all across the country know this. Tens of thousands of people have called me over the last few weeks and sent emails and letters. Who we choose to be the Secretary of Education doesn't just affect the over 50 million children who attend public elementary and secondary schools. It affects the future of our country. And it's a fundamental difference in views. A competitive free market system with winners and losers works in the private marketplace. I support that. Businesses open, they compete, they don't do well, they close, or they do very well and they go on and they grow. That's a strength in our country. But it doesn't work for educating our children because we can't afford losers. We can't afford losers when it comes to something as basic as fundamental education and creating opportunity for our children in the future. We need to provide every opportunity for every child to work hard and succeed. You know, I support having choices. I support magnet schools and public charters. I did that as a state senator. Other choices that are great opportunities for children. If there are equal standards and public accountability for taxpayers' dollars, and parents can have confidence in that accountability. And if it's part of the public school system, the public process, and only if they are in addition to quality neighborhood schools in every neighborhood, in every zip code. It's not just a slogan to say it shouldn't matter where you live, what kind of opportunity you get, or your child has. And that is becoming more and more true. It certainly is in Michigan, where this philosophy has been a test case, and we are seeing it across the country. We can't afford losers. A winners and losers system is not good enough for our kids. Betsy DeVos has a record of working against the vision of accountability and standards and choice within a system where every child has a quality neighborhood school in their neighborhood, in every zip code. She has worked against that vision. She doesn't believe in that. We have fundamental differences in what will help our children for the future. And that's why I will be voting no on her confirmation. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from